Hello and welcome to a PPT Mix notes video. For those who have never done something like this before, basically it's a PPT that we could have kind of gone through class, but rather than me just having everybody going through it at the same pace, I figured that this is material that you guys may have different levels of knowledge about it already, so you can kind of go through it at your own pace, and if you ever need to revise it before the test that will come up on this unit, you can always watch this video again if you wish. So obviously you can hear my voice, and then I've got a stylus here and I can write on the screen if I need to point out anything out. And so you just kind of go along with the note packet and this video, and pause it if you get tired and you want to, or if you want to copy something down, or if things are going too fast, you can always go back and watch it again. Alright, and if you're confused by anything, you can just let me know. You can raise your hand or send me an email or something and ask for further clarification. So hope you enjoy.
You shall not pass!
Okay, so this mix is to talk about biological molecules, and biological molecules are basically the building blocks that all living things are going to be made from. They're like the Lego bricks to the Lego sets in the Lego movies. They're all of the different components, and there's lots of different types, and they kind of have different functions, and each one of those types has lots of different examples that go under those different umbrellas. But the rule that we have with biological molecules is that absolutely all of them have to contain carbon. They are carbon-based molecules. So if there is no carbon present, it is not considered to be a biological molecule. And there, of course, means that all living things, at least far as we know in the universe, and definitely here on planet Earth, all living things must be based on carbon or built from these carbon-based molecules. Now, another term that you could use when dealing with biological molecules, or specifically molecules that are containing carbon, there would be organic molecules as well. So, if something does not contain carbon, what could we call that molecule? Anyone ever heard of taking the idea of an organic molecule? What would be the opposite of organic molecule? Hopefully you have heard the word inorganic molecules, right? So there are organic molecules and inorganic molecules, and actually some of this is more based around chemistry. A lot of this is going to look like chemistry as you go through these notes. And if you've had chemistry before, or if you haven't had chemistry yet, that's okay, because you can still learn all this information, but it might be a little bit easier if you've already done chemistry before. Now, there are basically four major classes or groups for our biological molecules. Do you think you know what they are? You've heard of them before. Four major things that all life is built from. And actually, you've probably heard of them before because three of them are really just a major form of nutrition for living things as well. So a lot of the things that we are building living things out of, there actually is the nutrition, the things that we want to eat when we have a nice healthy diet. So the first one would be carbohydrates, or the more common term would be sugars, things that are sugar-based. Carbohydrates, we'll learn more about those different features of carbohydrates as we go through the slides, but one of the things in terms of names that's nice and easy to remember in biology is OSE. If you see a word and it ends with OSE, it's a good chance that it is a carbohydrate or something that will build more complex carbohydrates. We have our lipids, or fats. So fats, under the idea that it's made from what is called a fatty acid, which is this thing. And fatty acids are really just long chains of carbons and hydrogens. And these carbon-hydrogen chains have lots and lots of energy inside of them. And so they are what fat is going to be built from. And the real proper word that we'd want to use for this group wouldn't be fat necessarily, because it's a common term. The scientific term would be calling them lipids. The next one is our proteins. Proteins are super important biological molecules. In addition to the protein that you might be taking that kind of helps build up mass if you're a weightlifting student or someone who's doing lots of sports. Proteins are important because they are the physical representation of DNA. DNA is what is all the information that is needed to make you look like you. How tall you'll be, what hair color you'll have, what eye color you'll have, things like that. Whether or not you're a boy or a girl, that's all inside of your DNA. But proteins make up most of what you physically look like. So your physical features, the features of a cell, the features of different types of organs in your body, a lot of that comes from your proteins. And actually your proteins do many, many different jobs inside of a cell and inside of your body. So they're a very, very important group. So we're actually going to talk about them first. And then the last group is our nucleic acids, things like DNA and RNA, which are there for storing information, which is information about living things is stored in DNA, and then it's moved around the cell in another form called RNA. We're not going to learn about nucleic acids in the cell's units because actually DNA and genetics are going to come in the next unit. So we don't necessarily really need to focus on nucleic acids at all for this next section that we're going to be going through. Okay, so all of these classes, all these different groups, all have basically the same atoms. They are built from the same elements. They are carbon-based, so there are a lot of carbon atoms inside of them. But then we also see an abundant amount of hydrogens, oxygens, and sometimes nitrogen as well. Nitrogen is very common in our protein and amino acid groups. So we have very similar elements connecting all of these different types of nutrition groups, and it's kind of one of the reasons why they have very similar structures in some ways and how they get used in lots of different ways. So they're a very important group, and again, they are biological molecules because about 96% of everything inside of your body is going to be within these four types. So 96% of you is some carbohydrate, lipid, protein, and nucleic acid. All of those together is what mostly makes up you as an individual and makes up a living thing. However, what makes up the highest percent of mass or volume inside of a living thing? Does anybody know? Or do you know? Sorry. It's water. Yes, you guys maybe have heard before that your body weight is about 70 to 75% water. So it's your water weight. So even though we've got all these different biological molecules and they make up 96% of your biological mass, about 70% of your actual mass is actually made up of water. And so water is a very important molecule. It's very important for different chemical reactions. It's important for moving things around inside the body. It's important for life. So actually, before we jump in to talk about these different groups, our carbohydrates, our lipids, and our proteins, we're going to focus on water first. Okay, so something you might have noticed up here in this corner here, it says add to page 2. And you might have realized, looking at your note packet and all the stuff I just said in that last slide, some of the stuff in your note packet is already there. It's already information that's already been written out for you because there's a lot of information. We do want you to learn all that information, but every once in a while there is information that you actually should be writing down. It's important that you write it down because it's not in your packet and you should learn to write down and summarize this information. Kind of help building your ability to take in large amounts of information and kind of summarize it and think about what should actually be down in your notes. So when you, for example, in a slide like this, it's telling you where you should be adding this type of information. That doesn't mean that you can't write down any extra information that you see as we go through this PPT, but when it says you should be adding this information to a specific part of your note packet, I would be doing that because that is important information that's not in your note packet that you need to add yourself. Okay, so as we go through water's amazing ability. So for as well as we can tell, all living things need water. Life would not survive or could not exist without water in some capacity. And there are some features about water that make water really great for life to exist and is the reason why life is able to exist. So the first thing we talk about is it being a universal solvent. Now, if you've never seen the word solvent before, a solvent is basically something that can dissolve or break apart other things. So for example, if we put sugar inside a cup of water, the water is what we, or the sugar is what we call a solute, or the material that is going to dissolve, and the water will act as the solvent, or the thing that helps break the water apart and move it around in small pieces. So a solvent, or universal solvent, means that basically it's really good at breaking things down and moving them around in solution. So it's really good at making different solutions for living things. Now, this comes from the water having natural polar charge to it, or the idea that it's not evenly charged. So if we were actually look at water here, or I could redraw it down here, this is our oxygen molecule, and then we have two bonds that are coming out, two covalent bonds, and then we have two hydrogens. And hydrogens have a slight positive charge. So there will be a positive charge here, and there's a positive charge here. And the let's use green. The oxygen has a slight negative charge. There's a little bit of a negative charge here, and a little bit of a negative charge here. So if we were to look at this molecule, we were to divide it, there's actually a region where we have more negative charges, and a region where there are more positive charges. And so that it's not evenly distributed between positive and negative charges. So we get one part of molecule that is positively charged and another part that is negatively charged, or what we call a dipole. So because of these positive and negative charges, they can also pool on things that are capable of making these positive and negative charges and help diffuse them and break them up inside of a solution. So we basically say that water is a polar molecule, polar meaning that it is charged, and then because it's charged, it can break apart polar substances or dissolve polar substances. So for example, if we took salts and we put it in water, salt, like sodium and chloride here, sodium is going to be positively charged, where chloride is going to be very negatively charged. So all the water molecules around it, around our positively charged sodium, all the negative oxygens here are going to be interacting with the positively charged sodium. Where over here with our chlorine, because the chlorine is negatively charged, all of the positive, all of the positive hydrogen ions are going to be interacting with the negatively charged chloride atoms. And so the water getting in here and kind of like pushing and pulling in all random directions is going to break apart the sodium and the chloride, which means it's going to dissolve. It's going to break it and dissolve it into a solution of salt water. So water's ability to do this is really important, because then we can physically move things around a cell, and we can move things around our body through the water's ability to make a solvent. Now, another thing that's important is the idea that water is less dense as a solid. So that means when it freezes, it actually expands, and as it expands or it gets bigger, its density is going to be less than the liquid water that would be underneath it. So, for example, here's our liquid water here, right? And it's a certain type of density. And then as it gets really, really cold, some of the water molecules, they get closer together, because cold things tend to stick closer and closer together, right? But then something magical happens. When it finally gets below freezing and starts to form ice, rather than get really, really close together in a random pattern, it actually makes a weirdly specific lattice pattern, or a crystal pattern, where everything lines up in very specific shapes. And these specific shapes cause ice to expand and be much larger than it is as a liquid. So you could actually experiment with this if you wanted to. You might make your parents angry. But if you take a sealed container of water, like a water bottle, and you put it in a freezer at home, when the water freezes, it will destroy the water bottle. It will explode in some way and rip all the plastic of the sides of the water bottle, because the water will freeze beyond the volume that the water bottle was made to hold, because all the ice water, as the water becomes ice, will get much, much larger. So this is important because that means that liquid ice is going to float on top of solid ice is going to float on top of liquid water. So that means that a body of water is not really going to totally freeze, or it's very, very difficult for it to totally freeze. So as our solid ice builds up on top here, on top of our liquid water, this liquid water actually starts to remain a little warm. It's kind of like an insulator that kind of keeps the temperatures of the water at a very nice, comfortable range. And so since the liquid ice is floating on top, it's very difficult for the entire system to freeze. And so, for example, fish and other animals that are living in an aquatic environment, when winter comes, they won't completely freeze and die. They'll actually just stay underneath the ice, and they'll be perfectly fine underneath the ice. So that means, in areas where we have really, really cold, long winters, that doesn't mean that all of the animals are going to die in an aquatic system. Okay, so basically life gets to be able to survive in water, even in areas where it's very, very cold. So important feature of water. Now, two other features of water that we want to talk about. Water also has a very high surface tension. And having a high surface tension is the result of having many hydrogen bonds, or these very weak interactions between the positive and negative forces that happen between all the water molecules. So remember, as I said, here is our oxygen here, right? And then here are our hydrogens. And the oxygen is a little bit negatively charged, and the hydrogen is a little bit positively charged. Well, again, positive and negative forces are going to interact with each other. So if we have another water molecule that's over here, wrong color, another water molecule that's over here, and there's going to be a slight negative charge from that oxygen atom that's right there, there's going to be a very, very weak bond that occurs between the positive and negative charge of that hydrogen here and the oxygen that's over here. And that's what we call a hydrogen bond. So hydrogen bonds themselves are very, very weak. The water molecules inside of a pond or inside of a pool of water, they're full of hydrogen bonds, millions and millions of hydrogen bonds. But they might be very, very weak. They're actually very easy for you to break. You can just stick your hand right into the water, and as you move your hand around the water, you're breaking the hydrogen bonds between different molecules as you're interacting with them. However, they can be really, really strong in high number, so they will allow things, for example, like our water spider here, to actually walk on the surface of the water, because its pressure as it pushes down on the water's surface is not as strong as the hydrogen bonds. So the hydrogen bonds are kind of holding the surface tension of that water together, which is allowing the spider to walk on it. And then we also, this force that's causing all this is called cohesion. So cohesion meaning like together. So cohesion is the force between water molecules as they stick to each other. And so cohesion results in relatively high surface tension. Now the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of water's great properties is our high heat capacity. The ability for water to absorb lots of energy and then to release that energy very, very slowly. So this is actually also a result of our hydrogen bonds. Each of these hydrogen bonds, even though they're weak, it requires a certain amount of energy to break them. So that means that liquid water can hold onto a lot of energy and actually takes in a lot of energy before liquid water eventually becomes water vapor or water in the gas form. So think about this anytime you guys are at home, you've probably boiled water before, and it feels like it takes forever to boil water, right? And that's because water can absorb lots of energy from the stove, and it does take a good amount of time to build up enough energy to cause all of the hydrogen bonds in our liquid water to start to break down so that the water starts boiling or evaporating, changing from a liquid to a gas, right? And then you think about it, even if you take the boiling water off the stove, you take it away from the heat, that boiling water is still going to be very, very hot. In fact, it's going to be hot for quite a long time. You should definitely not touch water that was just boiling, right? So that energy that's been absorbed into the water is also going to be released very, very, very slowly. So if water can absorb lots of energy and then can release the energy slowly, why do you think that might be important for life on Earth? So you know what you can do? If you want, you can pause this video and you can talk about this with another student. You can talk about this with me, or if you're ready and you want to hear the answer, you can just move on, all right? So basically, the reason that our Earth's temperatures stay within a normal range is because of water and its high heat capacity, because we have water in our atmosphere. So on the surface of the Earth and in the atmosphere, the water is going to absorb lots of the energy that comes from the sun, and as it absorbs it, it basically holds on to that energy and then can release it really slowly throughout the day and then out throughout the night. So during the daytime when it's really hot, it actually absorbs a lot of the energy, so it's not as hot as it would be. So it actually kind of keeps things a little bit cooler by absorbing energy from the sun. Then when the sun moves to the other side of the Earth during nighttime, all the water vapor in the air and the water vapor that's in the ground and in the water sources around us, they will all then slowly lose that energy now that the sun has gone away. So they will slowly release it. And as they release that energy, they are keeping the nighttime relatively warm compared to what it should be with the sun now on the other side of the earth. If we didn't have water having this property, if we didn't have water in our atmosphere, we would have daytimes and nighttimes similar to the planet of Mercury. So in Mercury, when the sun is hitting the side of the planet, the strength of the sun rays is so strong that we're getting temperatures that are in thousands of degrees. But on the other side of the planet, where it's not getting any sunlight at all, it's negative thousands of degrees. Because again, there's no way to hold on to energy, and there's no way to reflect or absorb that energy in order to have regular temperatures. So because of the high heat capacity of water, we are able to actually have normal temperatures on Earth that are able for us to sustain. Okay, so now we're going to talk about proteins. So proteins, again, I remember they're really important because they are what make you. You are basically a mass of proteins. Yes, you have DNA, and DNA is important because it is the blueprint, it is the instruction manual for making you. But proteins are mostly what the product is. So most of your DNA is going to be used for making different proteins, and those proteins are what are going to determine how well your cells function, how well your body functions, and ultimately what kind of characteristics you have. So there are a lot of different jobs that occur inside of a cell that go towards a protein. We have structural proteins, which in another slide I'm going to get through specific examples. So they're there just to physically exist, to build structures on. We have transport proteins and movement proteins. So ones that are designed to move things around the cell and to move your body. If you flex your muscle right now, as you move your muscles, what you're doing is moving proteins. So there are fibers, protein fibers inside of your arms, inside of your muscle cells. And those protein fibers get longer and they get shorter as you contract your muscles and you relax your muscles. So the movement of your entire body is built around proteins. You have regulatory proteins, ones that basically control how much activity is going to happen inside the cell or outside the cell or inside different parts of the body. You have enzymes, which are really, really, really important. And you're going to spend a lot of time talking about enzymes when you do biology, when you get to the DP level of high school. But enzymes basically catalyze reactions or chemical reactions inside of your cells. Chemical reactions inside of your cells have to happen at hundreds of times a second, and chemistry is actually not that efficient. Chemistry can actually be quite slow. So in order to make chemical reactions happen faster, the body has and cells have enzymes, and enzymes are these proteins that help make chemical reactions happen faster. Your hormones, for example, your testosterone, your progesterone, your estrogen, the hormones that physically change your body, they change your emotions, they link to how you feel, a lot of them are built on proteins as well. And then, of course, antibodies, or your immune system, right? So every time you get sick, you have white blood cells inside of your body, and those white blood cells find the bacteria or the virus that's making you sick, and they will kill it. But what they will also do is they will keep that information around so that you can produce the antibodies anytime you ever get sick again. So if that exact same bacteria or virus cell comes back and causes illness inside of your body, then the antibodies released by these white blood cells will actually kill that bacterial cells, kill the bacteria very, very fast. And so it will kill them faster than maybe you won't even realize that you're sick, because they'll kill the bacteria before you can even start to feel sick. So it's a very important feature of the immune system, and again, it's built on our proteins. And then, of course, we have toxins as well. Human beings don't really produce any toxins, but there are lots of animals in the world, plants as well, that produce different toxic materials, and the toxins that they are producing are again based on proteins. And the amazing thing about proteins is that there are, for example, inside your cells right now, in any one of your cells, there could be maybe 10 to 20,000 different proteins that are being used at any one point. And all of these different proteins are made from the same 20 building blocks, the same 20 amino acids. So amino acid is the building block of a protein, or like the Lego piece of a protein. So imagine if you had a Lego set and you only had 20 different Lego pieces. You can have as many of those 20 different pieces as you want, but there's only 20 different shapes, or 20 different colors, or 20 different forms of those Lego pieces. And so we can make tens of thousands of different proteins, all from these same 20 different pieces, just being used in different numbers and in different ways. So you should be able to identify an amino acid. So this is already drawn into your notes already, but you should have a good idea of what the structure of amino acid is for this unit and then for future units as you go on to study biology. So all amino acids are the same. They're built around a central carbon here, and we call it a chiral carbon or an alpha carbon. And then they will always have a hydrogen that's attached to them. And then on one side, there will be an NH2. And that is called an amino group. So the amino acid and the name, the amino group, is where amino acid's amino part comes from. So here, amino. And then next to that, on the other side, will always be a carboxylic group, or carboxylic acid group, which is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen with an OH attached to it. And so the acid part, an amino acid, comes from the carboxylic acid. So amino acids have an amino group and a carboxylic acid group. That's where amino acid, the name, comes from. Then on the bottom, we always have an R group, which is called a side chain. And the side chain can be one of 20 different things, and that's where we get the 20 different amino acids. So all amino acids are the same, except for, so this part of amino acids, this is all the same, except for the R group. And the R group, depending on which one we are using, creates any of the 20 different amino acids. That's where all the variation comes from. So these are these organic molecules, possessing both a carboxylic and amino group. And then, of course, we get the 20 different properties, 20 different amino acids and different properties of our amino acids from the side chains, or what we call our R groups. Okay, so now we're back into writing some things down on our notes packet. So you should have a table there. We're going to look at different types of proteins. And there are two different types of proteins. There are proteins that do action, or ones that we're using for metabolism. And there are ones that are structural, or are used for support. Okay? So I'm going to start going through some examples of metabolic proteins, or ones that do action. And you should just add down some information about these examples. Right? So our metabolic proteins, again, metabolic, they're all going to have very similar shapes. So anything that's a metabolic protein will be spherical. We also say that it's globular, like a glob, like a ball of gunk or something would be a glob. So they're all spherical in shape, and they all do some type of reaction or transport action. So they're all active ones. They'll do something. So the first example might be like enzymes. Enzymes, again, they all do a really specific chemical reaction inside of the cell. So one example might be amylase. Amylase is what breaks down starch into glucose. So anytime you're eating bread or pasta or rice, that you're eating really, really long, complex chains of sugar. And that sugar is great, but you need to actually break it down into an individual glucose unit. You need to break it down into smaller pieces, like that. And amylase is what's going to be responsible for doing that. And another thing, we talked about how OSE is a good way to identify something that is a carbohydrate. Well, the nice thing about enzymes is that enzymes all end with ASE. So anytime you see a biological word where ASE is at the end, you're dealing with an enzyme. And normally the first part of the name will tell you what it does. Unfortunately for amylase, it doesn't tell you what it does. Amylase breaks down starch. But it does have a similar, there's a connection between the name, but that's a little bit too advanced for you guys. Alright, so another example of action protein would be a hormone, and those are our chemical signals. So they're going to move around the cells, and they're going to move from body section to body section. So your brain might release hormones that go around to different parts of your body, and other parts of your body will release hormones that go to different parts of your body. And it's basically a way for cells to communicate with each other, and for different parts of the body to communicate with each other. And so a hormone is just a chemical signal. So one of the ones you might have heard of before is called epinephrine. Epinephrine is the fight or flight hormone. So for example, when you guys are walking through a haunted house and you feel your hair in the back of your neck is sticking up and you feel really stressed and you're scared and you're worried, that's because you have lots of epinephrine pumping through your body. Because you're in a situation where you are frightened and you are not sure if you're going to have to run really, really fast in order to stay alive, or you might have to fight somebody, you know, as hard as you can in order to stay alive. So epinephrine is basically increasing your heart rate, your breathing rate, releases lots of energy into your blood so that your muscles have energy in order to move really quickly, and it's getting you ready just in case something bad happens, and so you can react really quickly. And then our last example we have here is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a really important protein because it is responsible for transporting oxygen around the body because it is the protein located inside our red blood cells. You've probably already heard about blood and red blood cells in the past, but hemoglobin is the specific protein that allows red blood cells to actually hold on to oxygen for periods of time as it moves around the body. Okay, so these are just some, examples. Oh, sorry, I forgot. And the reason why it is called hemoglobin is because it has what we call a heme group. And a heme group is basically an iron 2+ ion. So because hemoglobin has this extra iron ion in it, the 2+, the positively charged iron, can interact with the oxygen's charge in order to hold on to the oxygen as it moves it through the body. Okay, so that's some examples of proteins that do action. Now let's get into some structural proteins. Okay, so some structural proteins are proteins that are there for supporting things inside of the cell. So structural proteins are a little bit different from our other proteins, our globular proteins. They're fibrous proteins. All right, they're fiber-like, or they're really long, thin strands. They are often just used for support and for structure, so they don't really do any activity necessarily. They're just there for things to hold on to or to support other things inside of the cell. So one you guys may have heard of before is called collagen. Collagen is very strong and flexible protein, and therefore it is what your tendons and your ligaments are made out of, and also different types of connective tissue. So your tendons and your ligaments are basically what are there holding your bones and your muscles together. So you already heard about how your muscles are a bunch of proteins that are moving inside of your arm, but your bones have to be attached to your muscles, and so that's what your tendons and your ligaments are going to do. And since there's a lot of pressure and strain on your muscles, because you're moving your whole body mass as they're contracting and relaxing, tendons and ligaments have to be very, very strong, but they also have to be able to change shape so that, the body is able to move. And so we have a nice flexible support protein like collagen. We have keratin. Keratin is a very strong protein that makes up your hair, skin, nails, and teeth. You probably didn't realize this, but your nails and your your nails and your hair are actually almost exactly the same in structure. There's just a little bit difference in your nails in order to make them really hard and strong, where your hair is actually relatively flexible and stretchy and light, right? But they are almost based on the exact same protein. Another thing you might not have realized is the horn that you see on the front of a rhino. So, if we have a rhino here, so this big horn is actually made out of keratin. So it's very similar to the structure of your nails or your hair. So it's not actually made out of bone, which some people might think, but it's more a protein. It's a structural protein instead. Then we have actin and myosin. Actin and myosin are two proteins that are working together in order to cause your muscles to contract. So inside of your muscles, we will have bundles and bundles of fibers, and these fibers will be, here's bundles of fibers, and then they themselves are in bundles. And then if we get down to the individual fibers here, and we are to look at these sections, we have light and dark sections, the light section, dark section, light section, dark section. And if we were to zoom in even more on those, we would see that they are just overlapping areas of actin and myosin protein. And so the myosin moves very, very, very quickly. and the myosin kind of like acts like hands pulling on the actin, and the actin is what moves closer together or further apart, depending if the muscle is getting shorter by contracting or getting longer by relaxing. But these are just two structural proteins working together to actually cause your muscles to change shape. And then the last one would be our cell membrane proteins, and there are lots and lots of different structural proteins inside the structure of a cell membrane. Now we're going to get into lots more information about a cell membrane and these different types of proteins later in the unit. So just remember in the next couple of classes when we start talking about cell parts, the cell membrane also contains proteins that are useful for structure. Okay, so that's it for proteins. So we've talked about water and why it's important. We've talked about proteins, the different types and things that they do. So we only got two more things to talk about. We're going to talk about lipids, and we're going to talk about our carbohydrates. So our lipids are water insoluble, and you probably already are aware of this. You know that oil and fats do not mix with water very well. If you took cooking oil, like we see here, and you mix it inside of a beaker full of water, eventually, no matter how much you shake it up, all of this water, or all these little globs of oil, will move to the top because they're trying to get away from the water as much as possible, because they're what we call hydrophobic or water-fearing. So hydro is referring to water, and phobic is a fear of. So you guys have heard of different phobias before, right? Like arachnophobia is the fear of spiders. So they are hydrophobic. They have hydrophobia. They're afraid of being around water, or they are not attracted to water. And they do not mix with water very well, so that is why they're always moving away from water as much as possible. So lipids are made of what we call fatty acids. And fatty acids, again, are really, really long chains of carbon and hydrogen attached to each other on some different type of basic molecule. And these long chains of carbons and hydrogen contain lots and lots of energy inside of them. So fats and lipids are a really good source of energy. So one of the reasons why lipids exist is to give us energy during periods when we're not eating enough food, or when we're really, really hungry. Then we can break down our lipids and we can break down these fats and create energy for ourselves. Typically, the rule is the longer the chain is, or the more carbons it has, the more oily or more hydrophobic that fat is going to be. So some fats that are really short, they actually can mix with water fairly well, but if it's a really, really long carbon chain, a really, really long lipid, it will be very oily in feeling, and it will not mix with water very well at all. Now, if we wanted to break down the parts of these lipid sections, these fatty acids here, this would be what we call a triglyceride. So here we've got a glycerol, which is a 3-carbon backbone or a 3-carbon molecule. And then to attach to it, we have 3 fatty acids. So here's a fatty acid, here's a fatty acid, and here's a fatty acid. So because of the glycerol combined with our 3 fatty acids, we can call that a triglyceride, or basically 3 fatty acids chain. And different triglycerides can have different properties. So there can be fats, triglyceride fats, which are semi-solids, and there can be triglyceride oils, or what we call liquids, or we'd see them as liquids. So for example, butter, you guys have butter at home, you can take it out of the fridge and it'll get softer, but typically real butter doesn't completely melt at room temperature. It stays as a really soft, flexible solid, because it is made out of fats, right? Fatty acids that basically can clump together really well and kind of make a solid material. If we had triglyceride fats that do not mix together very well, there's a little bit more space between them, at room temperature they would not form a solid, they would form a liquid, and that's what our oils are made out of. So even though the butter in your fridge at home and the cooking oil in your kitchen at home are both made from the same things, they have slightly different properties, and that's why one will be a solid where the other one will be a liquid. Alright, so then again, back into your note packet on page 3, we want to kind of go through the basic functions of lipids. So why do we have lipids inside our cells and inside our body? So first off, lipids are great because of insulation. So energy doesn't travel through lipids very easily. So heat energy can be trapped inside our body better if we are insulated with a layer of fat. So typically animals that live in colder environments, or mammals that live in colder environments like this walrus here, or our whales that live in deep cold areas of the oceans, they have lots and lots of fat, lots of lipids that are full, cells that are full of lipids all over their body, and it's basically insulating them to help keep them warm in really cold environments. We also are using them as a form of energy storage. So fat can actually hold a lot of energy. Of all of our different things, carbohydrates versus proteins, 1 gram of fat has almost as more than double the amount of energy as carbohydrates or fats. So fats are fantastic as a source of energy. So if we're not eating enough carbohydrates, enough proteins, then we start burning whatever fat we have left over in our body in order to be a nice source of energy when we're not eating well enough or we've been starving. So normally, at a lunch day, for example, if you missed breakfast, around the end of third period, you're probably going to start burning in some fats because you haven't been eating enough and you're running out of energy and you're doing all this thinking during class. And so your body's going to start breaking down these lipids in order to give you some more energy. Hormones as well. I remember I mentioned hormones being used by a form for proteins. So hormones are either made out of proteins or they are made out of fats. So for example, cholesterol and testosterone, these are all molecules that are used to communicate with different parts of the body. For example, testosterone, you probably have heard of this hormone before. It is the chemical signal that makes men be men, or makes men have male characteristics. So testosterone is released by the testes, or the male reproductive organs, and the testosterone will build up inside of the male's body, which causes them to have more male characteristics, like having a deeper voice, larger muscles, it causes them to get taller, get square shoulders, and then they start growing facial hair and body hair, and then they also start smelling really bad. So these are all caused by the hormone testosterone. And then our membranes of our cells. Now again, we're going to talk about membranes of cells and things later in this unit, not today. But remember when we start talking about membranes again, they are also going to be built out of balls of lipids. So when lipids come together and they form these little spherical sections like this, they're actually forming the outside, the barrier between the inside and outside of a cell. Okay. All right, so we talked about water, proteins, and lipids, and now it's for our last topic, carbohydrates. And actually, carbohydrates might be the easiest one to discuss. Carbohydrates are sugars, but we would also want to consider them to be what we call saccharides. Saccharides is the more specific, appropriate terminology for when talking about carbohydrates inside a biology class. And there are different types of saccharides. There are monosaccharides, which we call simple sugars. Mono is referring to one, or basically a sugar that is made out of a single sugar unit. And this would be things like glucose. Glucose is very, very important and for living things. We're going to talk about glucose a lot in other parts. You should start to also to remember this formula. Glucose is C6H12O6. It's important. It's going to come up later when we talk about cells using energy later at the end of this unit. So start memorizing it now, that glucose, its chemical formula is C6H12O6. We could have disaccharides, and this would be a sugar that is made out of two sugars. So for example, if we take glucose and we take another sugar called fructose, and we put them together, that creates sucrose. Sucrose is actually the sugar that you are eating the most. Most of the time, sugar that is used in industry, sugar that's used when we produce food or when we use baking, we're using sucrose sugar. And then we also have polysaccharides, and poly is referring to many, many sugars. So this would be a sugar that is made out of many, 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 many sugar units. It's very long, it's very large, it's very complex. And typically that means that it's insoluble in water, or that means it will not dissolve in water. Remember we talked about water being a solvent earlier. So water's properties of breaking things apart into little pieces, it wouldn't work here on a polysaccharide because they're just too large and complex. So this would be things like glycogen, which is how animals store energy inside of their body when they're not using it. starch, which is how plants will store energy inside of their body when they're not using it, and cellulose, which is what a cell wall is made out of. And we'll talk in more detail about what a cell wall is in the next class, but a cell wall basically is what supports a plant cell. It does not get digested very easily, and in the end, when you are holding a piece of wood, you're actually just holding millions and millions of cell walls. It's what wood eventually is made out of. Okay, so now the general description of our different types of saccharides. Let's just get into some specific examples of the different monodisaccharides and polysaccharides. So again, a monosaccharide is going to be made of a single sugar unit. Therefore, it is very small. It's very easy to be dissolved in water, so it will be soluble in water. And ultimately, it tastes really sweet. Anytime you're eating something, then it tastes really good, and you taste the sweetness, like ice cream or a donut. You're tasting it because it dissolves in water and interacts with the different proteins on your tongue. And so these monosaccharides, being very small, they typically form nice little ring shapes. And there are different 5 and 6 carbon monosaccharides, or they're made up of a ring that has 6 carbons or a ring that has 5 carbons. Now, the most common 6 carbon molecule monosaccharide, of course, is going to be glucose. Now remember, what is the equation for glucose? Did you remember that is C6H12O6? Gotta start memorizing it because you're going to need it on an exam. Okay, so glucose is the main source of energy for all living things. We love glucose. We love sugar. It's very addictive in some ways, and that's because it is the easiest form of energy for our cells. Our cells love to break down glucose and use it to keep themselves alive. So your body also wants you to consume sugar because it's what your cells need to survive. So that's why sugar, like glucose, tastes so great. The other 5 carbon monosaccharides that show up in biology that are also important. We have ribose, which is what is basically used to make RNA, and we'll talk more about that stuff in another unit, and the next we talk about genetics and stuff after this unit, and deoxyribose, which is used to make DNA. And so deoxyribose, where's my DNA? There it is. Deoxyribose and ribose are very similar to each other, but I hope you see that connection between the name, between ribose and deoxyribose. The deoxy part, in terms of the ribose, is because it's missing an oxygen. So if we look at ribose here, it has an OH group on this carbon number 2, where a deoxyribose doesn't have that OH group, it only has a hydrogen. So it's missing one oxygen. So there should be an oxygen there, but it doesn't have it. And that's why it is structurally a little bit different from ribose. So it has the name deoxyribose. And of course, deoxyribose is the D in DNA. Deoxyribose nucleic acid is what DNA stands for. Okay, so we'll talk more about RNA, DNA, and stuff like that in the next unit, the very last unit before the trimester ends. Alright, so some examples of disaccharides. Again, disaccharides meaning they're made of 2 different saccharides bound together. Disaccharides form when we take 2 saccharides and we stick them together with a bond through something called a dehydration reaction. And a dehydration reaction basically means that a OH group here on one sugar and the hydrogen here on another sugar, they are going to break off and they're going to come together and they are going to form water, H2O. So when we do a dehydration reaction, we produce water, or water gets produced, and then here between our 2 sugars, there is now a special bond, which we call a glycosidic bond. And that bond is what's holding these 2 sugars next to each other. So there's our glycosidic bond connecting the 2 sugars. Now, different types of saccharides that we have maltose, which is basically what happens when you take 2 glucose and you stick them together. You could have sucrose, which I've talked about before, which is glucose and fructose coming together. Fructose is a naturally occurring sugar that is present in fruit. That's where the fruit part comes from. So it's basically the sweetness that you're tasting when you're eating fruit. And then we could also take glucose and combine it with another sugar called galactose to create lactose. So lactose is the sugar that is found in dairy products like milk and cheese and ice cream. If somebody is lactose intolerant, that means that when they consume lactose, they cannot digest the sugar, and then that sugar ends up making them kind of sick. And so that is why they avoid eating milk and ice cream and cheese, because the lactose has a negative effect on their system, because they do not have the enzymes needed to break the lactose down. Okay, so these are different types of disaccharides. And for our last slide, polysaccharides. Again, poly meaning they are made from many, many, many sugar units all put together. They are insoluble in water, and there would be examples like starch, which are basically glucose in really, really, really long chains, like hundreds, or sorry, not hundreds, but tens of thousands of glucose molecules in one long chain. And they're basically used to store energy in plants. So anytime you're eating rice or potatoes or different bread products, you're eating things that have lots of starch in them, or basically glucose that's stored in a form that's insoluble to water and has to be broken down in order for your digestive system to get nutrients out of it. So eating rice and potatoes is a really good source of glucose, but you're going to have to spend a lot of time letting those enzymes break the starch down into individual glucose units. Then when we absorb all those glucose units into our body, we will create something called glycogen. And glycogen is basically when glucose is stored in short, branched chains. It looks something like this here. Lots and lots of branches all going off in random directions. And this is the form that energy gets stored inside of animals. So we can store energy as fats, and we can store energy as glycogen. So why do you think there are so many branches in glycogen, but there are not a lot of branches in starch? So starch typically is like this. It's just going to be a bunch of fibers all compact next to each other, right? But our glycogen looks like this. In glycogen, we've got all these random branches going in all different directions. So why do you think we might have that? What's one of the differences between plants and animals in terms of activity level? Did you figure it out? Yeah, so animals are way more active than plants, right? Animals are moving around. We've got muscles, and we run and jump and hunt things and stuff like that. And so we require the use of a lot more energy. Our cells burn through way more energy than a plant cell does. So plants don't have to worry about getting access to the energy that they've stored at a really fast rate. So because we have all of these little branches, we have all these little ends that we can rip a glucose off of anytime we need it in order to break it down to get energy out of it. So it allows for the quick removal of glucose, because we're very active things. And then our last one is cellulose. Cellulose is really, really long, strong chains of glucose, and they are very, very strong. They end up layering together to make lots of fibers. So a lot of different fibers, naturally occurring fibers, like the clothes that you're wearing, for example. If you're wearing natural cotton fibers, you're wearing cellulose. And it's really strong, right? You can stretch it and pull on it, and it's relatively flexible, but it's very difficult to break, right? In fact, what you're actually doing is you're interacting with the cell wall of plant cells. And we'll talk in more detail about what a cell wall does and the features of plant cells in the future. But basically, cellulose in this form, glucose in this form, it's a very special type of glucose that's formed as cellulose. And the reason and why it's so strong is because it cannot be digested by many things. So it actually doesn't break down very quickly like other living things do, or other parts of living things. So actually, if you have a tree and that tree dies, or you dry it out, you can cut it up and you can turn it into pieces of wood, and you can make planks of wood, and you can build a house out of those pieces of wood, and they will last for hundreds of years if you take good upkeep of that house, and you protect that wood, and you keep it stable. And really what you're doing is you're just building out of these empty dead cells, and the cellulose is the only thing that's left over. So the pencils that you're holding right now, maybe in class or when you're doing an exam, the wood that made those pencils is just a bunch of cellulose, or a bunch of leftover cell walls from those dead plant cells that the trees were made from. So it's very, very strong, durable material, and it doesn't break down very easily over time. All right, so that's been all the introduction that we have to our biological molecules. been a good amount of information, but hopefully you enjoyed listening to it and you got some good information down. In the next class, we're going to start learning about our cells and structure of our cells and getting into more specifics about cells units.